Anyone paying even the slightest bit of attention to the Senate right now would know that things are pretty hectic right now. The Democrats only have the majority thanks to Kamala Harris, the vice president, being able to break ties in the Senate. Removing Vice President Harris from the equation would give us a dead-even 50-50 Senate. Essentially, this means that nearly every piece of legislation that the Democrats want to pass would require unanimous consent from the entire Democratic caucus. Now, on rare occasions, the Democrats can pass or block something or confirm a nominee despite someone defecting from their caucus. But the vast majority of the time, the Senate Democrats desperately need every single one of their members to be on board. The extremely slim Democratic majority in the US Senate means that every eye is on the moderate Democrats on what they will do. Two moderate Democratic US Senators in particular are grabbing everyone's attention. Their names are Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. There are quite a few moderate Democrats in the US Senate, such as Mark Kelly, Tom Carper, and Chris Coons. As of right now, though, none of the moderate Democrats, besides Manchin and Sinema, are getting much attention from the press. Part of the reason why these two in particular are getting so much attention is because they are known for frequently bucking party lines or hindering progressive causes. For example, Manchin was the sole Democratic senator to vote for Kavanaugh, while both are against abolishing the filibuster. While Manchin and Sinema have definitely faced plenty of criticism for their refusal to abolish the filibuster, it's important to note that they may not be the only Democrats unwilling to abolish the filibuster. The difference between Manchin and Sinema compared to the other anti-filibuster Democrats, though, is that Manchin and Sinema, simply put, are getting significantly more press coverage. With all this out of the way, let's get back to the title of this post, Defending the Democratic Party's Big Tent Approach. I think it's safe to say that while the Democratic Party is generally center-left in American politics, there is quite a lot of ideological diversity within the party as well. On one end, there are self-proclaimed democratic socialists like AOC and Rashida Tlaib. All the way on the other end, you have socially moderate/conservative Democrats like the current governor of Louisiana, John Bel Edwards, who signed one of the most restrictive anti-abortion bills into law. Personally, I would describe the Democratic Party as a broadly center-left big tent party. When I say I am defending the Democratic Party's big tent approach to politics, where they run all sorts of different candidates with varying ideological beliefs, I am not saying I agree with everything that conservative or progressive Democrats do. I definitely disagree with Manchin's decision to vote for Kavanaugh, or John Bel Edwards' decision to sign a very restrictive anti-abortion bill into law. What I am saying is that this kind of approach to political campaigns is a net positive overall, even if certain Democrats sometimes do things that anger their party base. I know that I hold a few views myself that are unpopular within the Democratic Party, and I'd hate to be kicked out of the Democratic caucus as a hypothetical US Senator. The Democratic Party has always been a big tent party. It might be a big tent party because there are only two viable political parties here in the US that can reliably win presidential and congressional elections, or it might be a big tent party for other reasons. Regardless of the reasons behind the Democratic Party's Big Tent approach, one thing is for certain: the Big Tent approach helps the Democrats win elections. In the 2018 US Senate elections, Kyrsten Sinema won by about 2%, thanks to more than 1 out of every 10 Republican voters casting their ballot for her. In the 2018 US Senate election in West Virginia, Joe Manchin was able to narrowly win election by about 3 points because of about 1 in every 6 Republican voters casting their ballot for him. I can't believe I feel the need to say this, but I don't think there is enough evidence to prove that progressive Democrats are better than moderate Democrats at attracting Republican voters. I am not saying that progressive candidates are necessarily incapable of winning over a small but notable percentage of Republican voters, but I am implying that there is not enough conclusive evidence to definitely prove that progressives are better at winning over Republicans than moderates. The reason why I bring this up is because I have heard an argument for on social media that progressive candidates actually can win in strongly Republican areas, such as when Bernie Sanders won the 2016 Democratic primary in West Virginia. While it is true that Sanders did indeed win that particular primary, it doesn't prove anything about Sanders' popularity with Republican voters. NBC News noted that Sanders' voters in the 2016 West Virginia primary were significantly more likely than Hillary's voters to declare their support for Trump for the general election. To quote directly from the NBC News article, in fact, 39% of Sanders voters said they would vote for Trump over Sanders in the fall. For Clinton, 9% of her voters say they plan to come out for Trump in the general election. End quote. It looks like judging someone by their results in a small state's Democratic primary is not the best way to assess their actual popularity among the general public. Now that we got that out of the way, I'd like to talk a bit more about center-right voters here in the US. The website 538 once published an article detailing how the Republican Party has a structural advantage in the Electoral College, US Senate, and the US House of Representatives. The New York Times recently published an article that beautifully explains the structural advantage that Republicans have in Congress. Essentially, the Democrats are very good at racking up a ton of votes in urban areas, but those votes are basically wasted at the congressional level, since the districts those urban areas are in generally aren't very competitive. As Nate Kahn is able to state in a single sentence, the result is that Democrats have built national and statewide majorities by making Democratic-leading congressional districts even more Democratic, not by winning new areas that might turn congressional districts from red to blue. And yet, despite those structural advantages, Americans find themselves in a time where Democrats have a trifecta in the White House, US Senate, and US House of Representatives. As Ezra Klein, a journalist, points out in his interview with Obama, a major difference between the two parties on the national level is the need for Democrats to win over center-right voters. While the Republicans don't really need to win over center-left voters to retain or win back a majority of the seats in Congress. Obama, albeit very briefly, agreed with Klein that the Democratic Party needs center-right voters in their voter base to win majority control of the chambers of Congress. I know this sounds crazy, but just hear me out. What if listening to a Democratic former two-term president on how to win elections was a good idea? But then again, what does Obama, of all people, know about winning elections, am I right? Some people may find it upsetting to realize that the Democrats need center-right voters to win majorities in Congress. But as long as these structural Republican advantages are in place, the Democratic Party will need to continue its Big Tent approach if it wants to win more elections in the future. It might not be the answer people want to hear, but it does seem like something that Democrats will have to do for the foreseeable future. And right now, Democratic control of Congress and the White House is extremely important. I cannot stress how important it is for the Democratic Party to retain control of Congress, especially when about 70% of House Republicans refuse to certify Joe Biden's legitimate presidential victory. Right now, the battle between Democrats and Republicans is not just about good policies versus bad policies. It is also, more importantly, about democracy versus dictatorship. And yes, there are pro-democracy and moderate Republicans out there. But the Republican Party as a whole has turned very anti-democratic. So don't be a wise guy and list the 5 remaining moderate Republicans left that didn't try to overturn a secure and democratic election. Furthermore, part of what makes the Democratic Party so electorally strong is its ability to have a broad range of voters and politicians. Now, I understand why people would be annoyed by Manchin and Sinema's political views. I am annoyed by their views. Unfortunately, politics will always be frustrating. I think a lot of people seem to forget that compromise is not a bug of American politics, but rather a feature. Democrats will have to learn to compromise with their moderate members to get things done. One thing that the Democrats can definitely work on together in the near future is infrastructure. Senator Manchin himself has expressed interest in spending more money on infrastructure, partially through raising taxes. I don't claim to have all the answers to all the problems that the Senate Democrats face, but to act like there is zero progress to be made on anything is ridiculous. Chuck Schumer, the current Senate Majority Leader, usually has 96% of his caucus in agreement with one another. The key to more progressive legislation being passed, then, is not to continue to yell at Manchin and Sinema on social media thinking that you'll actually be able to do something to change their minds. A better thing to do is to simply think of ways to elect more Democrats to the U.S. Senate. The 2022 U.S. Senate elections won't be happening anytime soon, but there are definitely a few seats that the Democrats can hope to gain, such as the ones in North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Remember, the future of democracy lies in your hands. It sounds hyperbolic, but there is no way to sugarcoat things. The Republican Party as a whole has become anti-democratic, and when only one of the 2 viable parties in the US is willing to stand up for democracy and decency, the choices you have on who to vote, donate, and campaign for could not be more clear. The Democratic Party, for all of its flaws, is overall quite competent. Let's make sure it stays that way. June 28, 2021 update. Another great reason why the Democratic Party needs to continue its Big Tent approach was brought up by a terminally online Twitter user, Morgan M. McIntyre. As some of you may recall, in the 2012 Republican presidential primary debates, Romney had a more right-wing approach to immigration than Gingrich. Romney was trying so hard to win the primary that even as a moderate, he was willing to pander to the far right. I don't think Romney is a malicious man by any means, but the fact that he and others were willing to pander to the far right for votes meant that they helped contribute to the rise of Trump. Morgan points out that the Republican Party has a tendency to go more right-wing with their policies, while the Democratic Party is less susceptible to partisans in their party taking over. This is because the Republican Party functions as an ideological conservative bloc of voters, while the Democratic Party primarily functions as a broad coalition of various interest groups that are united behind a desire to win power. Unlike the Republican Party, the Democratic Party isn't interested in being an ideological peer party. That's why movements organized by the Justice Democrats, which tried to be the left-wing version of the Tea Party movement, failed. Instead of trying to promote a specific ideology, such as liberalism, centrism, progressivism, or democratic socialism, the Democratic Party is more aimed at promoting various policies that appeal to all the interest groups within the party. Different interest groups want different things, which means that the Democratic Party has to spend a lot of time catering to the needs of each interest group. The claims made in the paragraph above can be backed up with evidence. Gallup conducted polling among Democrats and Republicans in 2020 to determine how many people in each party identified as liberal, moderate, and conservative. Liberal in this instance simply means left-wing, while conservative simply means right-wing. Only 51% of Democrats identified as liberal, while 47% identified as either moderate or conservative. 47%! That's nearly half. On the other hand, the Republican Party has significantly more ideological uniformity, with 75% of the Republican respondents identifying as conservative. This other Gallup poll, albeit a bit old as it was conducted in 2018, also shows something quite interesting. The majority of Democrats want a more moderate party. Let me repeat, the majority of Democrats want a more moderate party. Meanwhile, the majority of Republicans want a more conservative party. To make a long story short, the Democrats do not operate as an ideological liberal party, even if the media perceives the party to be liberal. They currently operate as a coalition of interest groups working together to maintain power, while the Republicans operate as an actual ideological bloc of conservative voters. The large amount of different interest groups within the Democratic Party forces the Democrats to focus less on ideological purity and more on making sure that everyone in the party is satisfied with their policies that were specifically designed to appeal to the desires of each interest group.